a thumbs up if you got it. So while we're waiting for that, just a few housekeeping things. We had a little bit of a technical glitch. It was totally my fault during the last class. I did the whole live stream, and unfortunately, it was private. So I went back and I changed that and shared it publicly. But if you didn't get a chance, to catch the last class that we did, they're now on YouTube. So all you have to do is just search my name, Billy Gerald, or Fueled by Faith, and you'll be able to see that on YouTube. So cool. I'm getting the thumbs up from Zach that we are in fact we're live, and a couple of shout outs before we get started here. You see the picture behind me. This is a picture that's years and years old, but shout out to Hank and Jenny and Brad and John. This is a group of guys I used to race with and gal, and I really miss it. And so hopefully we'll get back together and do that soon. But shout out to you guys if you guys are watching this. Shout out to the Hervigs, rocking my Hervig House T-shirt tonight. This would normally be the time of year that I'd be gearing up and getting ready to go down to Road Atlanta, meet up with them and have a good time. But unfortunately, this mess has got us all stuck in the house for the time being. So shout out to Blaine and Rich and the boys. So hopefully you guys are checking this out, and hopefully we'll get to see you soon. So, all right. Well, I think we're going to give it just a few minutes. Comment or, give a thumbs up or do something. Let me know that you guys are getting this, that I'm coming through loud and clear. And like I said, I definitely want to make this as interactive as possible. So if you got questions or comments or anything, send them through. And like I said, I can see them right here in front of me. And Zach, he's sitting over there. He can see them as well. So, we can go ahead and try to treat this more like an in-person class. Because like I said before, I definitely feed off of you guys and your comments and everything. So I definitely want to make it as interactive as possible. With that being said, tonight's lesson is called Keeping Cool. And I think you're going to see that this is one of the most important things on any car, but it can be catastrophic on some cars. And our biblical tie-in tonight, I think, is really fitting as well. As I've said before, I'm not a pastor or anything like that, and so most of all these classes that I do is a message written to myself. This is something that I need to work on, and keeping cool is definitely one of them. So that being said, don't overheat. Be slow to anger. And I think this is something that everybody has heard, and it's good advice no matter who you are. But also, this is one of those things that is in the Bible, and I'm going to point out a few scriptures here about being slow to anger. So the first one tonight is James 1:19 and 20. So it reads, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires." And I hope you guys are seeing this. I noticed my screen blinked in and out a little bit. Is it blinking back and forth on your feed, Zach?
Not really.
Okay. But anyway, this was something that I really took to heart. This is something that was really kind of speaking to me, especially when it says be slow to anger, because, like most people that do this for a living, we can be a little quick to get angry sometimes. And I think that we can all have a short fuse when it comes to being in small spaces for a long time too. So just keep this in mind. This is a really good one, but this one I like also. Ephesians 4:26 and 27. "In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold." And I think that's pretty good advice. It says right here, you've read that before. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. But this is one that it specifically says, don't give the devil a foothold. So this is one of those ones where it's talking about, you let that anger build up. You lay down, you think about it, you go to sleep with it. This is something that can definitely give the devil a foothold in your life, and that's obviously not what we want to do. Next one, cool down quickly. And this is something that, again, this is our biblical tie-in to our car deal, but this is good advice too. So when you do get angry, because we're not perfect, and it will happen, even though, hopefully it doesn't happen as fast as it used to. When we do get angry, we need to trust in God. We need to cool down quickly. And Romans 12:18 and 19, this is Paul talking here, and he says, "If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge.' I will repay, says the Lord. Now, this is another one that's pretty tough sometimes. This is one where, you do get angry, and, maybe it did take a long time, but now it's saying don't take revenge. You live at peace with everyone because it's God's place. So, somebody does you wrong, you get angry for some reason. Leave it to God. Leave it up to Him to take care of that. And I know that's easier said than done, but that's the goal here anyway. And this is Jesus speaking right here, and this is kind of along those same lines. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And I think this is one of those verses that a lot of people have probably heard before, and you've probably read over it several times. I know I have. But one of the things that I really like about this is that he states point blank right there, in this world you will have trouble. And that's something that I think a lot of folks, maybe we bypass, maybe we as Christians, we're kind of like, why are we having trouble? Why are we having this problems? Why does this happen to me? But again, this is Jesus talking here, and he's saying it's going to happen. But he has overcome the world. And so that's where he says, I've told you these so that in me you may have peace. So I hope that everyone can take that to heart. And then the third point I want to make about keeping your cool is maintain your cool. Let go of the bad. So in this picture here, we've got some dirty old nasty coolant, and we've got some brand new coolant. And you see good and bad are labeled on here. But you can see the difference here. Now, who would want that in your car, right? You wouldn't. You would want to let go of that. Let go of the bad. And we'd want to be filled up with the nice, new, fresh, good coolant. So along those lines, we've got Colossians 3:7-8. You used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived, but now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language from your lips. And yes, I know if any mechanics out there are watching, that's kind of a tough one for us too, but I'm working on it. But this is one of those things where you want to let go of the bad, like we were talking about. You want to flush out that bad. And so it's saying right here, rid yourselves of all these things, this anger, malice, slander, filthy language. So this is one of those things that it's pretty point blank. That's pretty much speaking right to you. And then Proverbs 22:24-25. Do not make friends with hot-tempered person. Do not associate with one easily angered, or you may learn their ways and get yourself ensnared. Yes, I see. I got a little typo there. That's supposed to be get yourself ensnared. But this is another example of good advice about letting go of the bad, about flushing out the bad. You let go of the anger and the malice, but also you may have to let go of that person, that person in your life that is easily angered or hot-tempered, or, otherwise you may end up being just like them. And that's what it's saying right here. You may learn their ways and get yourself ensnared. And nobody wants that. All right. With that being said, we're going to dive right into tonight's lesson on keeping cool. Now, I hope you guys can see this. I know it's kind of like a lot of small print on here. I did put a link to the handout materials where you can get this and print it out or look at it on your computer or whatever. So if you're having a hard time reading that, hopefully that will work for you. But I'll give you the gist anyways. So what we're talking about is thermal efficiency. And that is, bottom line, what we're trying to handle when we talk about cooling systems on a car. And not just cooling systems, but a lot of systems on a car that have to rely on different types of coolers. And we'll get to those in a minute. But efficiency can be defined as the amount of heat energy used for doing work compared to the amount of heat energy actually created. Or in other words, the percentage of heat energy converted to useful power. And I know that sounds like a mouthful, but we'll talk it out. Most modern gasoline engines are only 20 to 35% thermally efficient, leaving quite a lot of heat lost to the exhaust and the cooling system. So basically, for all the fuel that you're burning, all the heat that you're creating, gasoline engines only use about 20 to 35% of that to actually make power. The rest of that is lost to, some to friction, most to the exhaust, and most to the cooling system. So if we can harness that, if we can make a car more thermally efficient, then obviously we'll be able to make more power with the same amount of fuel, which is the name of the game. Turbocharging, if properly done, can be used to regain some of that energy lost to the exhaust. Mazda and Toyota are working to increase their thermal efficiency to over 50%. Now, as far as I know, that hasn't been released yet, but there has been some experimental engines where they're talking about getting the thermal efficiencies over 50%. And just to put that in perspective, I've got a picture of a Formula One car here. Hopefully you guys can see that. It's a 2018 Mercedes Formula One car. And as of 2018, the Mercedes Formula One engine was said to have the highest thermal efficiency of any petrol engine in the world, at just over 50%. It's rumored to have made between 750 and 950 horsepower from 1.6 liters. And that gives you an idea of how big a deal it could be if Mazda and Toyota can actually get that to work, because now you're talking about huge amounts of power from a very, very small package. And Formula One is it's no surprise that they would be the best at that. Unlimited budgets and unlimited technology. But that's just an idea of how big a deal that could be. This is a pretty cool graphic. This is from Formula1Dictionary.net. But let's assume that this is 100%. That's the amount of energy you are feeding into that engine. That's the amount of fuel, amount of energy applied is the yellow. And you can see in the green right here is how much is actually being used to do work, actually how much is being used to make power. And you see it's about 25% in this case. It's a rough estimate. Most of them are between 25 and 35%. You see this small one, we're losing 5% to friction and parasitic losses. So that's, friction in the timing chains, friction in the bearings, friction in the camshafts, just, general rotating friction inside the engine. 30% is being lost to the cooling system and 40% out of the exhaust. And that's the 40% that you would harness with the turbocharger, and that's how they work. They use that heat energy in the exhaust to actually move the turbine to make boost, and it's a whole other class on turbocharging. But that's where they're harnessing a lot of that lost power. The part we're going to talk about tonight is this 30% loss to the cooling system. That's a lot of heat. That's a lot of heat that engine has to deal with, and not just the engine, but the car as a whole has to deal with. And we're going to talk about that right now. So this is kind of a rough idea of a cooling system layout. Again, I don't know how well you guys can see this. I hope you can see it okay. But we've got our engine, and we've got cooling passages, water channels all inside the block and the cylinder head. You can kind of see between these pistons, these hollow areas. That's where coolant would flow. We've got our radiator. We've got an expansion tank. We've got a heater core and our hoses, water pump and everything connecting that. But that's a lot of complex parts just to move water around in an engine. And it actually gets much more complex than this. But this is a pretty good idea of what we're talking about. So in this case, we've got coolant that's in the radiator, and it's being cooled by air flowing through the fins. And because of the radiator's construction, it's transferring that heat from the coolant to the radiator and then being pulled out by air. As that water is circulated through the block, that cooler water is now picking up the heat inside these jackets from combustion. So it's actually absorbing heat out of the block. And it's being pumped through and back to the radiator where it gets cooled again, and it's recycled over and over again. The heater core works on exactly the same principle. Hot water is pumped through there, and we get air blown over the fins, and that hot air that you feel inside the car is actually created right here from heat being transferred from the coolant through the heater core and into the cabin of the car. The purpose of coolant. Now, you've heard me use that word quite a bit. It's more than just water. Now, I know you can just put water in a car and it'll work, for a little while, at least until it gets cold enough to freeze anyway. But there's several reasons why that's a really bad idea. Coolant it's used for the removal of heat from the engine and transfer to heat exchangers or radiator. It's designed to maintain an optimum engine temperature, usually between 195 and 220 degrees. And it prevents boiling or freezing by use of chemical additives such as ethylene glycol. That's what most coolant is made out of. It prevents corrosion caused by electrolysis and or oxidation. And it lubricates cooling system components. So there's a lot going into this. When you pour coolant into your car, it has a lot of jobs that it needs to do. Like it says right here, it needs to not boil, because if the coolant boils, then it's no longer transferring heat. It needs to not freeze, because obviously if it's frozen, it's not moving any heat either. And it needs to prevent corrosion and oxidation, because there's a lot of different metals in a car's engine. There's iron and steel and aluminum and various other alloys, and all of those react differently with water. And so there's corrosion inhibitors inside of coolant, obviously, to keep that kind of thing from happening. Now, again, this is probably hard to see, but there are three main types of antifreeze or coolant used today: the IAT, the OAT, and the HOAT. And the IAT stands for Inorganic Acid Technology, and it's the traditional green stuff that you see used in older cars, and it was used years ago pretty exclusively. It uses silicates and phosphates known for corrosion inhibitors and the expected life for this product is about 2 years or 30,000 miles. So this is what you used to see in old cars that you'd have to change, every couple of years. And it, like I said, it does the job, but a lot of that was designed for older cars that didn't run as high a temperature and had big brass copper radiators and wasn't trying to cool down really high compression or turbocharged engines, or and they didn't have a lot of aluminum in engines back then either. So that was okay for older cars. Then they moved on to OAT, or organic acid technology. And this was the first long life coolant. If you guys remember the Dexcool that GM used to use, the orange stuff, this is where this came into play. The gold stuff that Ford uses. I think Honda's is blue and BMW's are red, and everybody's got their own color. But the bottom line is this OAT type coolant was developed for high aluminum content engines, and obviously more thermally efficient engines, which they put a lot more stress on the cooling system with high compression engines and turbocharging. So this stuff, new corrosion inhibitor, protects aluminum better than IAT. The service life is about 5 years or 150,000. That's what it says on the bottle. I wouldn't recommend going 150,000 before changing it, but that is what they say. Dexcool is an OAT-based antifreeze, but not all OAT antifreeze is Dexcool. OAT-based antifreeze is not compatible with IAT and will create a mud consistency in your cooling system. You guys probably seen that out there. Older GMs, especially GMs from the 90s, I'm being told to slow down a little bit. They were really bad for this because, you had a car that had orange coolant in it, and maybe you had a leak, or maybe you replaced a component, or whatever the case was, and all you had lying around, or all you could find, was the plain old green coolant that your dad's truck used to take. And so somebody would mix it in there, and they say, oh well, coolant's coolant, and they'd send it. The problem with mixing IAT and OAT is that they do not work well together, and you get this mud, this kind of you'll see a picture of it in a minute, but it's really not a good deal. So the bottom line is you want to try and put back in the car what came in the car. They do have some universals out there that are capable to mix with either one, and that's fine. I've used that plenty of times. But you want to be really careful about that. Like I said, if you are going to use a universal, make sure it is in fact a universal. Make sure you're not using, mixing IAT and OAT. And usually would have it on the bottle. Now, something that is newer than that is the HOAT, or hybrid organic. Much like the OAT, it's got a service interval of about 5 years or 150,000 miles. And again, that's advertised. I don't think I would go that long. But it has an additive package that allows it to be compatible with other antifreeze types. So this is the stuff that you see labeled as universal. And again, that's pretty new. That's just come along in the last few years. And it's not hurting anything. Like I said, if you mix that with the other two, but you definitely don't want to mix the old green stuff with the old orange stuff, because that could be a major problem. And you'll see that in just a minute. This, again, I don't expect you to be able to read everything on this chart. This is from Xerox, by the way, and I just wanted you to kind of get an idea that there are several different colors. You see, each one of these colors is a different type of coolant. And we got the brands over here: GM, Chrysler, Ford, Mercedes, BMW, Audi, and then Toyota, Lexus at the bottom. And you can see that they use different types of coolant as the years gone by. And again, a lot of that has to do with the heat load of the engine, actually how much heat it produces, and the components inside of it, like what they're made out of, the actual material makeup. So yeah, you can see that there's several different colored options, and Xerox is a great brand. I would definitely recommend going back with them if you do end up having to use any. Here's what I was talking about. This is what it looks like when you mix the IAT and OAT. This is actually from a GM, and you can see right there it says use Dexcool coolant only. That's how the old GMs used to say it. I don't know if you can see that on your screen or not. I'll try to get out of the way. But again, this is this mud, this kind of buildup, and that actually is happening from the coolants intermixing and not playing nice together. So just thought I'd throw that in there as a little bit of a warning. So let's talk a little bit about heat exchangers. Now, this is the basis for this whole thing. We use the term heat exchanger and radiators kind of interchangeably sometimes. The heat exchanger is a device for transferring heat from one medium to another. So basically, in the example of a radiator, we're transferring heat from a liquid, a coolant, to the air. There are liquid to liquid heat exchangers, and there's air to air heat exchangers, kind of like an intercooler. But in this case, we're talking about radiators. So we're talking about liquid to air heat exchanger. And most all automotive heat exchangers are made of aluminum, plastic, and copper brass. And they very rarely use copper brass anymore. But older cars use copper brass radiators and copper brass heater cores and that type of thing. But for all intents and purposes, aluminum and aluminum plastic are what we're dealing with nowadays. The increase in strength of aluminum over copper allows for large interior tubes for coolant, resulting in much higher cooling efficiency for a given size. So basically, they can get a much more efficient heat exchanger with aluminum than they could with copper brass and make the radiator smaller. Now, again, that plays into OE strategies of making smaller hood and frontal areas, trying to get the most aerodynamic design that they can. The smaller they can make the grill, then obviously the slipperier the car will be and get better fuel economy. This is actually why it's they usually only have just enough radiator. You hot rod guys out there, you start turbocharging nitrous, high compression. You start doing anything to make more power and stressing that cooling system even a little bit more than it was designed for, and you start running into problems. And that's why, because modern cars are trying to get away with the least amount of cooling system they can to save weight and to actually shrink the front area of the car down a little bit. That's why cars now have a very small front end, and 32 Ford's got a giant grill, right? So they're trying to make them as aerodynamic as they can. So that's something to keep in mind if you are doing any kind of hot rod stuff. Heat exchangers, like I said earlier, can be liquid to air, air to air, or liquid to liquid. But in this case, we're talking about liquid to air. I hope you guys can see this, but this is basically like a cutaway of a radiator. You see we've got these thin tubes, and this would be your tank on one side, and this would be going to the tank on the other side, and it can either be up and down or they can be side to side, but either way, you're going to have one on one end and one on the other. And there's going to be small tubes that run from one tank to the other. And between those tubes are these fins, and I'm sure you've probably all seen this. And the surface area is the key component here, because the more surface area you can have in the tubes and the more surface area you can have on the fins, then the more efficiently it'll transfer heat. That's why you usually see these fins, really, really compacted together. The trade-off is the tighter you make them packed together, the less air, the less freely air can move through them. So there is a trade-off there, and there's been some different designs, and they play with the shapes and the spacing and all of that of the fins. But you don't want it so tightly packed that air can't go through it easily, and you don't want it so wide open that no heat gets transferred. So that's something to consider. But hot coolant enters the tubes. Heat from the coolant is transferred from the coolant tube to the fins, and heat is finally transferred from the fins to the surrounding air, or the air moving through it. So let's check out some other heat exchangers. Like I was saying before, most all heat exchangers that we deal with nowadays are aluminum. Again, older cars, they were copper brass, but the design was almost identical. They might have been a little bit bigger, but the design was the same. But when I say radiator, everybody kind of has the right idea that, it's up front, it's a big aluminum piece. But other heat exchangers in the car that work under the same principles are your AC condenser, the heater core, oil coolers. Most cars run oil coolers nowadays. Transmission cooler. A lot of cars have external transmission coolers, especially trucks, and AC evaporators along with the radiator. And all of these are types of heat exchangers. But tonight, we're going to fit mostly on the radiator. Fun fact, talking about heat exchangers, the Bugatti Veyron has 10 radiators. 3 for the engine, 1 for the liquid-to-air intercooler, 2 for the air conditioning system, 1 for the transmission, 1 for the engine oil, and 1 for the differential oil, and 1 for the rear wing hydraulics. The hydraulics that control the rear wing actually have their own radiator, their own heat exchanger. And a lot of modern cars, you see power steering coolers and things of that nature, are differential coolers on trucks especially. But yeah, so you can have pretty much any fluid you can have in a car, there's probably a heat exchanger for that. But yeah, I just thought that was a fun fact. He uses 10 radiators. And when we talk about radiators, we'll talk a little bit about the construction. This is typically what you'd see on a modern car. Aluminum in the middle. You see this one is a side tank style. They can be tanks on the sides or tanks on the top and the bottom, but the principle is the same. It'll have an inlet, generally at the top, and you have a filler cap somewhere on it. Not always, like, you know, Chryslers and things, they put their filler caps elsewhere. BMWs also, you know, use a remote filler, but most of them will have a filler cap on it. You have a tank, fins, tubes, and what they call the core. Now, I know some of you guys out there, you know, have heard of 3-core, 4-core radiators, or, you know, thick core radiators, that kind of thing. They're actually talking about the thickness of that center section. And again, that goes back to surface area. The thicker you can make that, the more surface area you can actually have in contact with the coolant, and the more efficient it'll be. The trade-off of that, of course, is space and weight. So again, this goes back to OEs just playing that fine line between, you know, keeping it as light and small as possible, but still big enough to do the job. And then we'll have the outlet at the bottom. And so you can kind of see how this works. You know, coolant enters this tank and fills it up. And then you can see these rows where coolant will actually be pumped across this to the outlet and back to the engine. And in the process of being pumped across this, the air moves through these fins and actually pulls heat out. So fairly straightforward, fairly simple design. But as we'll see, there's quite a bit that can go wrong as well. While we're talking about radiators, we'll talk about pressure. Cooling systems are often kept at a pressure between 14 and 18 psi. What this does is actually increases the boiling point of the coolant. Now, I don't know, you know, anybody knows hydrodynamics or thermodynamics knows that a fluid under pressure, its boiling point is increased. And this is why we raise the pressure in the cooling system. This pressure is maintained and regulated by the radiator cap most of the time, or an expansion tank in the case of an external, you know, under pressure type situation. But never, ever, I put these in red letters, never, ever open a cooling system on a vehicle when it's hot. Now, I know everybody's seen that label and seen that sticker under the hood of their car, but this is actually not just there because, you know, legal reasons. This is actually there to warn you, do not do it. Do not open it while it's hot. And the reason being is because the instant loss of pressure will cause a flash boiling of the coolant and explosive release of the superheated steam and liquid. So if you got that thing under, you know, 18 or 20 psi of pressure, the boiling point has been raised up above what it would normally be. And as soon as you crack the cap on it, now you've dropped that pressure, and so it instantly flash boils. And that's why you get that explosive release of steam and everything. It's not so much the pressure as it is the flash boiling that is the dangerous part. But the way that these caps usually keep pressure on there, I hope you guys can see this. I don't know. Again, this is in the handout materials that I listed in the description. But there's a rubber seal at the bottom here, and there's a spring inside that cap. And that spring is calibrated to a certain pressure. And as that pressure is met, this will actually lift off the seat of the radiator and allow coolant to bypass. And you've seen those recovery tanks, you know, old cars didn't have them. They just dumped them right onto the ground. But modern cars, anything past, you know, the mid-70s, have an expansion tank where that coolant will actually expand, you know, go through here, go into the expansion tank, and until the pressure is back down to where that spring will reseal the radiator cap and it will hold a certain pressure. Now, when it cools, the opposite happens. You know, there's a vacuum placed on it when it cools back off. And as that vacuum is pulled on the system, when the engine cools down, it will actually suck coolant back out of the expansion tank and back into the system. That's why if you ever checked your expansion tank, if you ever checked your coolant level, it's different when it's hot and when it's cold. And this is why. Because as it releases coolant to bleed off pressure, it catches it and you'll see the level rise in your tank. And when it's cold, it will suck it back in and you'll see it drop. So that's most all OEM manufacturers that I know of usually put a range. They have a hot and a cold fill range on their expansion tanks. And that's just something to keep in mind. Now, I talked about earlier about most of what we see nowadays is aluminum and plastic. Well, these are two examples of two of the same radiator, but built very, very differently. And this is when we talk about stock versus purpose built. You know, I said earlier that OE manufacturers are going to do the bare minimum they can to get by. And you can see that really good in this example. This is the same radiator, but this one has a much, much thicker core, a fully welded aluminum tank, and a much different fin and bar design. I don't know if you can see that on your screen, than the factory one. You see right there, it's got plastic crimped on tanks, a very, very thin core, and not as many fins in that core. And you could see that this one was just going to cool a lot better. Now, granted, that's going to take up more space and it's going to be heavier, but it's going to do a much better job. Here's a close-up view of one, and you can see plastic tank with the cap on it, and you see the race car one, all aluminum, fully welded. Much, much better design. Usually when you see radiators fail, it's usually where this crimp meets the plastic, and we'll see that in just a second. Right here, here's a good example of some radiator failures. So there are really four basic ways that a radiator will fail. You can see this one is blocked up externally. You can see there's grass and dirt and God knows what else, birds and everything else, all in the front of this radiator, blocking airflow through the fins. So now it's blocking air being able to get through the fins. Here we see one of the plastic tanks. It's actually cracked. It actually become fatigued from so many thermal cycles of being hot and cold and hot and cold, because it expands and contracts and expands and contracts. And this is usually where we see them fail. They usually fail right along this seam, because the old copper brass radiators, they were soldered or brazed in place, and it was a much stronger design, although it was much heavier and less efficient, but it was very, very strong. With these ones, they're very, very light, but that crimp is a mechanical crimp. They can't weld plastic to aluminum, obviously. Unless one of you guys out there know how to do that, I'd like to hear from you. But in this case, that can only take so many thermal cycles. So again, that's something to be on the lookout for. Here we also see mechanical damage. Maybe you had a water pump come apart, or something got in your belt and got thrown around inside there, or I don't know, you ran over your neighbor's mailbox and the pole went through the grill of your car and you end up with fin damage. That's something that a lot of people kind of overlook, but that's very important that you don't have fins laid over like that, because that will cause an airflow disruption, and any air that can't go through it can't cool the coolant. So, and then here we've got deposits and rust. We talked about it a little bit earlier about the Dex Cool mixing with the green coolant can do this. Rust in the block can do this. Any kind of additives, somebody put stop leak in there or something like that, you can usually see that built up sediments. And this is a good time to talk about two things. One, something almost nobody does, but it's a really, really good idea, is you really should use distilled water in your radiator when you mix your coolant. No coolant is designed to be used. Well, let me take that back. Very, very few coolants are designed to be used straight out of the bottle. Almost all of them recommend a mix, and usually 50-50 coolant to water. The 50% water that you use, you'd be really well off to use a distilled water, because there's no sediments, nothing in there. I know your tap water probably looks good, but when you boil it off, you get the little white powder and stuff in there. Well, all of that will end up in the bottom of your radiator. So keep that in mind when you do that. And also another one that people don't think about a lot is engine grounds. I know you're thinking, how can engine grounds cause something like this? But a poor engine ground can actually increase the likelihood of electrolysis inside the engine. So that water is moving around. It's getting hot, getting cold, and there's various different types of metals. There's aluminum and iron and those type of things. Well, that actually can create an electrical current and actually create electrolysis, where you get rust and corrosion and everything created by the coolant itself. And so a good engine ground can actually cut down on that. So it's just something to keep in mind. So we talked a little bit earlier about controlling temperature. We talked about controlling the pressure with the radiator cap. But how does the engine actually control the temperature? You can't have it wide open or fully closed, because it'll run really cold or really hot. We want to try and maintain that optimum 195 to 220 degrees. And they do that with a thermostat. The design of thermostats hasn't changed a lot over the years. If you look at a thermostat out of a brand new car and one out of an old car, the basic layout of it is going to be very, very similar. And the way that they work is they actually use a wax pellet. And I know that it doesn't look like much. It looks like kind of a springy UFO kind of thing right here. But the way they work is actually they stay closed when the coolant is below the melting point of that wax pellet. So you've got the coolant flowing, and there's a bypass around it, and it's flowing through the engine from the water pump, and it's just circulating and circulating while it heats up. And then once it reaches the temperature of the thermostat, usually around 185 to 195 degrees, that wax pellet actually melts, and it allows that spring to pull down and coolant to flow out to the radiator. Now, as it goes out to the radiator, that coolant gets cooled and gets pumped back into the engine. and that cools back down, and it will close again until it gets hot enough and open. And it will constantly do this at not a very fast rate, but it will keep the engine at a certain temperature. This is also why it's important not to run a car without a thermostat. I know you can get away from with it, in an emergency situation. You can pull it out and it'll stay cool, but you don't want the coolant to be circulated through the radiator all the time, because the engine will never come up to temperature and the combustion chamber will never come up to proper temperature. So you actually you can do some harm there, and you actually have a loss of efficiency, loss of power. It's just it's a bad deal all the way around. But modern thermostats are usually designed to fail open. Now, older cars, you'd have them where they would fail and they wouldn't open, and the car would overheat really short amount of time. Modern cars are generally designed to fail open. So if the thermostat doesn't work, it will stick open, and you'll usually get a code, coolant below temperature or something like that. Any of you guys out there driving a Traverse, you know what I mean, or Equinox, pretty common code on those cars. But usually when you get that code, it's because it's failed open, and it's actually not keeping the engine hot enough. It's not a matter of overheating. It's not keeping it hot enough. And then the other part of the cooling system that we're going to talk about is the fan. Now, there are two major types of fans. There's mechanical fans and there's electric fans. So mechanical fans usually use some sort of clutch. A fan clutch is a cooling fan that can freewheel at low temperatures when cooling is not needed, allowing the engine to warm up faster, relieving unnecessary load on the engine, and as temperature increases, the clutch engages so that the fan is driven by engine power and moves air to cool the engine. Now, this is probably something you've seen on older cars. There are few modern cars that still use this. Trucks, F-150s, Rams, Chevy trucks, that kind of thing. A lot of those still use this type of system. This is something that it works halfway decent. It works okay, but this is another area where a lot of people overlook. These clutches, they do wear out. They are wear items. They can only take so many cycles of hot and cold and engaged and disengaged before they fail. And a lot of times when they fail slip. They fail open. So, you might open the hood on your car and see the fan turning, but the problem is that it's not pulling any air. You could actually stop it with your finger. I don't recommend doing that, but you actually could stop that very easily, because once it gets loaded up, it doesn't pull any air. And so usually if you have a problem where a car will overheat sitting still, but cools down going down the road, it's a very, very likely problem that the clutch is the problem. And also AC can put a lot of tax on this too. If you're sitting in traffic and you're running the AC, that AC condenser is generating a lot of heat. There's not a lot of air moving through the radiator because you're sitting in, Atlanta traffic for 2 hours. You're putting a lot of stress on this fan clutch. So, something to keep in mind. If your AC is not really performing like it could, it might be a good place to look. Make sure you're getting air pulled through the condenser. And then the electric fans, this is the one that everybody is seeing nowadays. There's really two major reasons for this. One is front-wheel drive cars obviously don't use a fan clutch, because having the fan on the side of the engine isn't going to do you any good. So they needed to come up with some way to pull air through the radiator, even though the engine is in the car sideways. So electric fans came along. And electric fans are most commonly used on modern vehicles due to the ability to be mounted remotely, and they can be controlled by the computer. Now, the nice thing about electric fans is they take the load off the engine. Now, if any of you guys watch Roadkill, you know David Freiberger, and me and Zach are looking at each other right now. He has a show on Motor Trend called Engine Masters, and they did a fantastic job of actually showing how much power different types of mechanical fans can sap out of an engine. And it was actually quite a bit more than even I expected. So definitely, if you get a chance to go over and check that out, it's a great episode that they did. But that mechanical fan is actually putting load on the engine. It's actually pulling horsepower they could be used to move the car forward. And that's a drag on power. It's a drag on efficiency. So electric fan solves that problem. I would definitely say that if you're dealing with any kind of hot rod, mud truck, import car that you're building any more power into, that probably would be one of the first things I would upgrade on the car. Is if you still have some type of mechanical fan, I would definitely say go to an electric conversion. But that's all I've got for you guys tonight. I see that we've got quite a few on. I know I talk really fast, and I apologize for that. So let's take this time right now to, if you have any questions, if you have anything that you want me to go back to, or anything that you want cleared up, send me a message. Go ahead and put it right in the comment section. I can see it from here. Zach, he can see it from over there. So I would definitely like to hear from you guys on what you thought. If you have anything that you want to ask, let's go ahead and have it. And if not, then we'll end for this one. But hopefully I get some feedback from you guys. Who all is watching tonight anyway? Can you post up and say, I see Alan Anderson is watching. I see Allie Swanson. Hey, Allie, how are you? Tell Neil I said hey. But if anybody else is out there that wants to let me know, go ahead and hit me up. And as always, we'll have this posted on YouTube and Facebook, and you guys can, send a message or drop a comment or whatever later on. I would definitely like to hear from y'all as far as what kind of topics you'd like to see, and what we something we haven't covered here. So definitely let me know if there's something that you guys want me to cover. And if there's no questions, hey Ronnie, how you doing, buddy? I see you watching. If there's no more, then we'll go ahead and pray. And again, as I say on all these videos, if you guys can have any prayer requests, if there's anything we can pray for you over, if you're not comfortable putting them in the comment section, that's fine. Send a message to me, send a message to Tanglewood Church prayer team. There's lots of ways that you can get in contact with folks to take care of any prayer needs you may have. But again, if you feel comfortable, post them up here, and we'll go ahead and take care of them for you. With that being said, let's pray and get this one wrapped up. Dear Heavenly Father, we pray that you would be with each and every person that might see this video. Father, I pray that they may gain something from this, Father, spiritually, technically, both. Father, I just pray that you would continue to be with me and be with everybody that is affected by this thing we've got going around. Father, I just pray for a quick resolution. I pray for your hand to be seen in anything that we do. And Father, until next time that we get to meet again, I pray for safety, Father, for everyone and anyone that might see this. And it's in Jesus' name, amen. All right, guys. Well, until next week, I hope you guys had a safe and happy Easter. And we'll be doing one of these every Sunday night at 6 p.m. So hopefully we'll see you there. All right, guys. See you later.